Thanks for joining us today. This is a little presentation I like to call What I Learned in Pontevedra, a degrowth pilgrimage. And I wanted to start off by saying that this journey is a big trip for me because I hadn't flown for 5 years, had not flown in an airplane. And in part, that was because of concerns about the climate crisis. And we could talk about all kinds of really alarming statistics about flying. I'll just note what the BBC said, quote, mile for mile, flying is the most damaging way to travel for the climate. So please think twice before flying. I'll just leave it at that. But also, I'd been reading a book. Some of you might have read it as well. The Future is Degrowth. And you see the subtitle there. That might offer us a little bit of a definition of what degrowth is, because it says a guide to a world beyond capitalism. And yet I would take issue with that because the book itself actually makes the case that degrowth is also a world beyond real existing socialism. And as we'll see, there's other definitions of degrowth. But when I had the opportunity, I decided that, yes, I would gladly attend the 10th International Degrowth Conference and 15th Conference on the European Society for Ecological Economics on June 18th through 21st in Pontevedra, which is in Galicia, which is in Spain, and get on an airplane for the first time in 5 years. My mission, I had two missions really: to make a presentation and also to present this poster, the poster that we all know and love, The Cycles of Gaia Ecological Calendar, going on behalf of the Gaian Way. A question that immediately came up is who would come with me? Maybe my wife and daughter would like to accompany me. I was surprised when they both showed a distinct lack of enthusiasm at the prospect. And so I resigned myself that this was going to be a solo trip. Well, that can have its advantages as well. And I started to warm up to the idea eventually. An adventure all on my own across the Atlantic to Spain, a country I've never been to before. I did have some challenges, some other challenges, a knee challenge, a torn meniscus, which was impairing my movement, making it difficult to even walk, a tooth challenge, which resulted in an emergency root canal and crown just days before I left, and a geography challenge. I didn't even know. When I think about Spain, I think about the Mediterranean. And like I said, I've never been there, but I didn't know that Galicia is a whole different part of Spain. As you can see, it's in the upper left-hand corner, about as far from the Mediterranean as you get. And it's really the Celtic part of Spain. In fact, the only thing I knew about this area is that it was where you find El Camino, or the way. It's a pilgrimage, and that's a marker that you see for it there. And of course, I have to give credit where credit is due for all the photos and images you see on this page from Wikimedia Commons. But most of the photos you'll see in this presentation are just photos I took myself along the way. So, just before I left, the New York Times published an article, Shrink the Economy, Save the World, which is a pretty, I would have to say, positive, upbeat article about degrowth. I took that as a good omen. Oh, I had one more challenge too, my packing challenge. I had to bring that tube, a big, heavy tube full of all these posters. And I also had the backpack and my little carry-on bag. And I was worried, you're really only allowed to bring two things on. And I was worried that, I didn't want to check a bag because that can be disastrous in my experience. So I figured out that I could put the backpack in the suitcase and only have two items. So this was great. So I was pretty excited. I got on the airplane and I arrived in Madrid. And yes, my daughter had come with me after all. She changed her mind at the last minute and we scrambled to get her passport. And I was so excited to be in Madrid with my daughter, Persephone, that I took her photo as soon as we got off the plane. This photo. But where's the tube? Where's the poster tube, Bart? That's right, I put it down to take the photo, and I never picked it back up. And before I knew it, we were on a tram on our way out of the terminal, and there was no turning back. I consulted at the lost and found desk, and they said, maybe if they could locate it, maybe it could be shipped to me, but guess what? They never did. So that was disappointing, but we made it to Pontevedra, so I was excited about that. This is the Puente del Burgo, the Burgo Bridge across the Larez River. It's a medieval bridge. It was actually built over an older Roman bridge, ancient Rome. Are you kidding me? Possibly the origin of the city's name, Pontevedra. And as I mentioned, this is not exactly the sunny Mediterranean. We discovered it was cold and it was wet. And so on Sunday, we also found out that everything was closed. I couldn't even buy an umbrella. But my initial, and this, I just had to throw in a few photos, cool photos that were taken just for purely aesthetic reasons. This looks like an image of Frida Kahlo's face floating in midair, but it's actually a reflection of a neon sign. I just thought that was kind of cool. Anyway, my initial impressions of the city were just of overwhelming urban density, even though it was really a small town. But it had all these high-rise buildings, block after block after block. We did a little sightseeing. We saw this famous church, Iglesias de Santa Maria la Mayor. And then we randomly stumbled across a protest against a cellulose plant.
Celulosas, fora, fora, fora. Enfermería, Miñal Filulloa. Celulosas, fora, fora, fora. Enfermería, Miñal Filulloa.
Now, if you're Spanish or your Galician isn't that great, you might not know what they're chanting. But I was told that this was against a paper plant that is as big as one of the local cities. And I was reminded actually of the local struggles back here at home in Louisiana against the massive Formosa plastics plant that we've been battling for years. But my favorite part, and there were signs all around the city for the conference that I was attending. This asks, are you addicted to growth? It's a conference on degrowth. My favorite part of this day, though, was that when Persephone went off exploring by herself while I sat and rested my knee. And indeed, I did finally get my umbrella, found a place that was open. So, Monday morning, I started off the way, as all good Gaians know, we like to start the day off by meditating outside. How could I meditate outside when I'm up in this little second-story apartment? Well, I did have a little balcony. And this is the view from that balcony. So I did my little morning meditation there. And just in case you're wondering, we were on top of this shoe store. So you can see the balcony from the street. Just gives you a little idea of where we were staying. But I had to quickly make my way across the river to the School of Forestry Management. For this is actually before the conference itself. That Monday was spent on the 5th annual assembly of the degrowth movement before the conference actually began. And this might be a good time to give you a definition of degrowth that was offered here or from degrowth.info, that it's a reduction of production and consumption in the global north and liberation from the one-sided Western paradigm of development. This could allow for a self-determined path of social organization in the global south. And that global aspect was really in evidence on that day of the assembly of the degrowth movement. In particular, it started off with a joint statement from a Muslim and Jewish duo demanding an end to the genocide in Gaza. And indeed, there were watermelons everywhere. Watermelons, as you may know, are a symbol of the Palestinian movement flag, because of the similarity to the colors, is even on the map that they distributed at the conference. They had that little watermelon there. And a highlight of that day was the arrival of this bicycle caravan. Now, it may not seem like much, but keep in mind that these people had been riding for days to get there. That's right, they rode their bicycles all the way to Pontevedra from all over Europe, joining together at points along the way, spending several nights on the road. And it was really, kind of cool to see them arrive. And just after the bike caravan and the and lunch, somebody latched up. Remember my backpack? You might wonder why I was even telling you that I was bringing this backpack. Well, I had this patch on the back of the backpack, and the patch mentions New Orleans, a local band in New Orleans. And somebody latched on to that patch and called out to me because even though she was a native of Galicia, she had lived in Houston for a while, and so she knew New Orleans very well. And she immediately introduced me when she heard that I was with the Gaian Way. She introduced me to this guy, Manuel Casal, also a native of Galicia, founder of 15 magazine, and a fellow Gaian. In fact, I had so much in common with him. I'm still in correspondence with him. We exchange messages regularly. He actually knew about the Gaian Way. He knew who Eric Asadurian was. And so it was cool to meet him. It was cool to make lots of connections on that at the Degrowth Assembly. It was cool to be surrounded by people of all ages, conference goers, young and old, from so many different nations, speaking so many languages, or rather speaking English with so many accents, and aspiring to such transformative work. And we got a good comeuppance from a speaker repping the Global South at the very end of the day's program. It was delivered with love, though. And that evening, Persephone got some cotton candy made by a robot. That's right. It's artificial intelligence at its finest. She did not attend the conference with me, right? So she was hanging out on her own during the day, doing stuff. I was actually trying to divide my attention between looking after her and going to the conference. But usually we would get together and do stuff like this in the evening. Well, the next day, I finally, a colleague had suggested maybe a print shop, a local print shop could help out with the poster problem. And I thought, what are you talking about? I can't possibly print a version of the poster, but I realized in the internet era, of course I could, because Eric was able to send me a PDF of a print-worthy version of the poster, and they were able to print it there at the print shop. And so my mission was saved. And then, and also there was this dance studio that I came across called Getting Jiggy. I just had to share that with you. The sun came out. Oh, they have fruit shops there. They have shops where they sell just fruit. The sun came out and it was glorious. I was taken in by the spray of this fountain. And then I was really arrested. I was moved to tears, actually, by a Galician gaita played by a street musician in the Plaza de Peregrine. And, this is a tradition. These are bagpipes. I told you it's the Celtic part of Spain. They play bagpipes there. And you'll be able to hear some of that music if you tune in to Earth Eclectic episode number 15. I'll remind you of that at the end of the presentation. But a few other things. We went to Disc Burgers, and I ordered combination plate number 2, but instead we got 2 combination plates, language barriers. And then the kickoff of the conference proper. This photograph, this panoramic photo, shows you how many people were there. Standing room only in this auditorium, much bigger than the assembly the day before. 1,200 attendees. And I found a way of putting these panoramic photos online using a site called Kula. I can navigate around and kind of give you an idea of just how many people were there. It was kind of amazing. And of course, I can't share with you the whole presentation, but there was music, there was song and dance, there were speeches, and all kinds of interesting things going on. So clearly, degrowth is growing. And this might be another time to throw in another definition, that degrowth is a planned reduction of energy and resource use designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. And I always have to cite my sources, of course. That's from none other than Jason Hickel. He's one of the leading luminaries of degrowth. Well, there was also a song about degrowth. Again, that's featured in the episode 15 of Earth Eclectic, if you want to hear it. The plenaries and concurrent sessions really got going on Wednesday. So after fetching the printed posters a Wednesday morning, I got to catch the politics of materials and the plastic industry, which reminded me of some basic facts, things that I knew, but were framed in a new light. We are in a global plastics crisis. It's not just pollution, but also an immense carbon footprint, which is contributing to climate change. And the issue is really best understood as being driven by capital accumulation, a phrase that should be familiar if you read that book on degrowth. So I was learning some new language to describe things I already knew. We have to cap production, and most people do support that idea. They support the idea of capping production. We just need to make it politically possible to do. I was half a world away, but so much of this applies to the struggles back here at home, the area between New Orleans, where I live, and Baton Rouge, which is not that far away. It's known as Cancer Alley. And there's all these petrochemical plants. Formosa plastic plant that I mentioned earlier is one of the biggest ones. Cancer Alley was mentioned in this presentation there in Spain. Well, I installed the poster. That's me with the poster. And people were immediately intrigued. They were coming by, checking it out, talking to me. But I couldn't linger. I had to run back to Pontevedra proper for a walking tour of Pontevedra. This is our tour guide, Pedro. And he gave, the only photo I took of him had his eyes firmly shut. But we saw so many interesting things in this 1 hour walking along. We learned about the carnival traditions of Pontevedra, of the medieval excavations that were underway, of the crucieros. That's those like a crucifix made out of stone, but on top of a tall pillar. There's actually 12,000 of them across Galicia. But most notable to me, of all things, is the fact that they have banned automobiles from the city center like 20 years ago. So you see that picture of the street in the middle? That was basically what it was like to walk around in the old town part of Pontevedra. Very rarely would you see a car. It was like a pedestrian paradise. And they've won awards for urban design and for pedestrian safety and so forth. And after a few days of walking around there, I started to notice that I was feeling much more relaxed. I'm so used to dodging out of the way of cars here in America. It was a really nice change of pace. And of course, we had to note some, similarities with back home in New Orleans. The Spanish architecture, they call it the French Quarter, but we all know the architecture is Spanish because it burned down under Spanish rule. The seafood, the carnival traditions, the Catholic influence, the trees even, some of the same trees. And the differences. Of course, New Orleans is very auto-centric. Our structures are made of brick and wood. New Orleans is flat as a pancake for the most part. And we have 383,000 people. Whereas Pontevedra is car-free. It's made of stone. The entire town seems to be made of stone. It's hilly. My daughter had never climbed hills like that before. And it's only 82,000 people. How does it seem so much more dense? How does it seem like it's Manhattan or Brooklyn? Urban design. And that evening, the conference program was more than just the conference. They had a lot of programming outside of the conference to try to take it out to the people, things that were open to the general public. I took Persephone that evening to see a screening of a movie called 2020, The Walk. And it was produced by a member of Extinction Rebellion. You see her there introducing the movie. And it's basically a film of her walking with that backpack all the way from Spain to Helsinki. And there's a monologue the whole time, a monologue of her talking about the climate crisis. And if you're familiar with Extinction Rebellion, they're very strident in their rhetoric. So she was talking about basically how we're all doomed. and how we're screwing the future generations, and how every time you hear an airplane overhead, it's an indication that there's one more person who doesn't care about the younger generations. And I was, this is all stuff I agreed with, and all stuff I've even talked to Persephone about, but I might soften it a little bit when I talk to her. And this was not soft, right? This was I was worried as we sat there watching this movie. How is Persephone taking this? Is she getting upset? Is she getting depressed? Is she crying? What's going on? But as it turned out, the narration was all in Spanish with subtitles. Turns out she couldn't see any of the subtitles because she was too short to see over the guy sitting in front of her. So I had nothing to worry about. Nothing at all. At this same event, they also announced La Cultura Declara la Emergencia. You may be familiar with this movement. Started with local governments who were declaring a climate and ecological emergency. That's something I advocated for when I ran for office, that the city of New Orleans should declare a climate emergency. And Culture Declares Emergency was founded in 2019 in the UK. It's arts and culture individuals and organizations. So this is the launch of a hub for Spain. And we were there to bear witness to that. And then we had an extraordinary meal at this restaurant. I finally got some vermouth. Do you know they mix red and white vermouth there? The Spanish, they love vermouth, but I never knew they would do that. And we also got to watch as a seagull snatched a hunk of meat off of another diner's plate. It's true. Well, the summer solstice was Thursday. I thought everybody would be talking about the summer solstice, but nobody seemed to, except for me. It was also designated as Global Degrowth Day. And started off with a session on anarchy and degrowth towards rebellious, prefigurative, and insurrectionary degrowth ecologies, with Alexander Dunlap kind of running the orchestrating 3 different presentations. That's him in the baseball cap, pointing his finger at me and asking why I was taking a picture. He yelled at us a lot, actually, but it was kind of fun. It's a plenary session on the circular economy. You might have heard about the concept, of the circular economy, efficiency and technological solutions. Of course, degrowth emphasizes the need for more fundamental restructuring of the economy and, a reduction in overall consumption. So the circular economy sometimes is presented as compatible with economic growth, and that conflicts with degrowth's core premise. So Kirsty Hobson argued for diversifying and degrowing the circular economy. Wow, there's a lot to think about. In fact, it was too much. I had to tear myself away. I had to go for a walk and clear my head before my session because it was my time on the program. Well, I had to share the time. In fact, in this one session, it was called T10.3. It's a pretty huge conference, right? T10.3, Challenging Dominant Values, Ideologies, and Imaginaries. And the whole thing was, again, orchestrated by Mallory Zinju Zhan. She was the facilitator, but she's also one of the presenters. She said we would have 13 minutes each. And she gave her presentation first on community initiative for sustainable consumption, co-designing climate solutions in urban China. And basically, they did this gamified thing where they got with Chinese citizens, presented them with a game where they could make choices. And these were fairly affluent and ecologically concerned Chinese citizens. And what choices would they make to reduce their carbon footprint? And it was quite interesting. They learned, for example, that people give up all kinds of things, but they really didn't want to give up eating meat. And I would have thought that would be easy. Apparently, no. It's like the last on the list for a lot of people. So this is very interesting, but she took a lot more than 13 minutes, so it left less time for the rest of us. But that's okay. The other presentations were all quite interesting as well. This guy, Lucas Heck, talked about how a child does not function like clockwork, advocating for basically honoring the work and the labor of childcare, which is often not done for various technical reasons. Exploring the intersection of tourism and environmental values in indigenous communities of the Southern Amazonian Trapezium, which is in Colombia, by Natalie Chris Abrams Chow. And then we had Nate Rowetti, who presented about these two classrooms, one in Alaska and one in New Zealand, both with indigenous teachers and mostly indigenous students. And they collaborated, these two classrooms, obviously using, internet technology. What really made this interesting, though, was that, I was 100% sure that I would be the only person at this conference to kick off my session with a song. And Nate proved me wrong because he went right before me. He was the presentation immediately preceding mine, and he kicked his off with a song. He sang an indigenous people's song from New Zealand. I was blown away. So yes, then it was time for me to do my presentation, the role of spiritual philosophies in communities in supporting and promoting degrowth. This is something Eric actually pitched, originally came up with the idea of and submitted successfully to the conference. But I did try to make it my own. I won't go through it all again, of course, because some of you have already heard me give the whole spiel. But one of the key arguments was that spiritual and religious beliefs generally, and eco-spiritual worldviews in particular, can play a role in sustainability transitions. And while I was doing that, my daughter was doing our laundry. And I mentioned this because she'd never gone to a laundromat before. She never, we always do laundry at home. So she ventured out on her own in a strange city, where they speak a foreign language, and she did something for the first time. She went to a laundromat and successfully did our laundry. So I was very proud of her for doing that. And I think this was really, a great experience for her, as banal as that may sound. The fifth plenary session was really interesting on technology and democracy. It was about the right to repair movement. And I'm sorry that this photo isn't better, but you might be able to see that that's a picture that he's showing there of Han Solo fixing the Millennium Falcon. And he was making the point that in the early Star Wars movies, the ones that were made first, things were always breaking down, and they constantly had to be repairing things. And that was a real theme in those movies. But then in the more recent movies, that theme goes away. And it's because, he thinks, that we've moved in, there's been a transition in our society away from fixing things and just replacing them. And so the right to repair movement, I think it has gained more ground in Europe, but it is starting to show up in America as well. Something important to keep our eyes on. If we can repair things, obviously, we don't need to replace them, and that is more sustainable. I also participated in this thing called Sustainability by Default, an audio walk for radical reflection, which invited us to take photos of things through these cards with these slits on them. I really didn't quite understand what this was all about, but it did give me an opportunity to take what I thought was a cool photo, just of these people walking through that arch, that passageway. Anyway, speaking of which, it was also such a pleasure to walk around Pontevedra. And that evening, we went to the Alameda, the park, for what they called the Protestival, a festival and a protest for Global Degrowth Day. And look, there's a guy. I thought that was funny. He's holding a sign that says "Degrow the police." But can you see there's actually a police car in the background behind him? One by one, different local activists took the stage. This is the local Galician chapter of Greenpeace. And then we saw Extinction Rebellion. I don't really know what's going on there with the red robes, the white face paint. They're not, this video is not in slow motion, by the way. They're actually just moving very, very slowly. Apparently, this is a thing that they do, and you could probably learn more about it. My daughter was really perplexed, but it was very striking, you got to admit, Extinction Rebellion. And really, it was powerful to bear witness and to stand in solidarity with an array of eco-activists local to Galicia as they took the stage one after another, and they shared their manifestos as the moon rose over the Alameda de Pontevedra on Global Degrowth Day with the crowd from the 10th Degrowth Conference. It's pretty cool. On Friday, I was drawn to a session on something called contemplative pedagogy. Actually, this is something that I kind of have studied and know a lot about in my work at Xavier University of Louisiana. And I wasn't even sure, should I go to that session or should I go to something that I don't know so much about? But I was glad that I did, because I learned about embodying degrowth, about healing from alienation, about radical rest as an act of refusal. It was really, I felt like, in line with a lot of our Gaian values. And they even gave us some fruit. I was proud to be able to peel my orange in a single peel. The sixth plenary session on rethinking innovation was, alternative approaches for people and planet. That's what they called it. They brought up here, I think, again, a phrase that you might remember from our reading, the imperial mode of living. And I was just struck by what a useful phrase it is. It's memorable, it's pithy, it's fairly easy to understand, but it refers to something very complex, namely how the everyday practices and consumption patterns and lifestyles of people like me, and quite possibly you, rely on the exploitation of resources, labor, and ecosystems in other parts of the world, particularly in the global South. So I've resolved to try to work this phrase, the imperial mode of living, into my active vocabulary, and I'd encourage you to do the same. Still working on that. I went back to part 2 of embodying degrowth and healing from alienation. And we did an exercise where they showed us a short video about plastic pollution. It's like 1 minute long, but it was very, very disturbing. And then we were invited to draw our reactions, draw how that made us feel. So this is my cartoon. As you can see, I'm kneeling and I'm screaming in pain. That's how it made me feel. We also heard from Alice Damiano, who shared with us some really moving poetry that she'd read about our relationship with the earth and the universe. Definitely Gaian in spirit. And then explicitly Gaian when we heard from Gisela Ruseco. She's from Colombia, but living in Spain. She did a session on decolonizing our minds as a part of this same this same embodying degrowth and healing from alienation series. It was about reconnecting with nature, and she referenced Stephen Harding. And so that was, again, another pretty cool connection to make. The 7th plenary session was on climate change and degrowth. And this was going over a lot of data that was that came out that summer that you may have heard about. Undoubtedly, you had. Carlo Buontempo was the director of the Copernicus Climate Service for the EU, and he was there talking about it. I won't go over all that data because I'm sure you guys know it. But he did highlight this one particular chart. I will mention this. He just talked about this chart of sea level rise as being the scariest data point. And the reason is because the trend is so clear and pronounced, going all the way back from 1992. You don't have to extrapolate much. It's just there in the data, right? The wavy line almost tracks with the dotted line. And it indicates that this trend is likely irreversible in our lifetimes. And for someone living in a low-lying city like New Orleans, it's very alarming, right? And of course, this is something I know, and probably something you know. But I wondered as I looked at this and really sat with it for a moment, do we sufficiently communicate these basics to people that we meet and talk with in our local communities? And the final session I attended, We Are Here Too, a workshop on how language affects climate and on radical inclusion of the non-humans in the language of policy documents by some scholars from Poland. And this is particularly of note, of course, because in the Gaian Way, we've been trying to represent the more than human world in our decision-making process. I am in partnership with this ancient living live oak tree, southern live oak, here in New Orleans, and I try to bring this tree's perspective with me when we consider the direction of the organization. It's a steep challenge, and that's so I had to attend that session. It was a perfect way to end the conference, in my opinion. Of course, we did some more exploring of Pontevedra after that. We learned that this thing is that they called a tortilla. It didn't look like a tortilla to me, and the rest of the world calls it a Spanish omelet. And just some graffiti that happened to bear a striking resemblance to the ironwork right next door to it. Anyway, our final meal, I learned that scallops do come in shells. In fact, that shell is the symbol of El Camino. So it's a perfect way to end our trip. And I wasn't able to actually be there, but some members of the conference, including Gisela Ruseco that I mentioned earlier, they organized a singing of the degrowth song. The degrowth song that was written by the famous, legendary Croatian songwriter Darko Rundic at the previous year's conference, which was in Zagreb. And I'll just sing you a wee bit of it to give you an idea. What does degrowth mean? Is it a missile word against economic growth? Boom, 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 boom. What does degrowth mean? Is it a deprivation of all we want to hold? Ho, 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 hold. Or it's the end of the careless living? Or is it learning the art of giving? 'Cause we all know less is more. What earth you've got in mind? What if you look inside you, seeing the life as one that we all belong to? Seeing the life as one that we all belong to. I mean, could you ask for a more succinct summation of Gaian values? Seeing the life as one that we all belong to? I found that extremely moving. So we made our way out of Pontevedra, back across Spain to Madrid. We didn't really spend any time in Madrid except to fake up a photo to make it look as if we'd done something there. Back to the Madrid airport. My daughter fulfilled her dream of having a meal at a McDonald's in a foreign country. And that evening we spent actually in London at the Heathrow airport, where they have a strange system. You have to put your card into this slot to turn on the electricity in the room. They could have explained that a little bit better. But to make a long story short, yes, we did make a tube ride to Osterley House. It was the only thing that we could legitimately have time to do before we got back on a plane to go to the United States. And guess what came out just before I got on that plane? That's right, another article on degrowth, this one from the Washington Post, this one very negative, a negative opinion piece. Degrowth is deranged. Well, it gave me a lot to think about on the ride home. as I headed to Europe for this big degrowth conference, the New York Times published an essentially positive article. As I prepared to return home, the Washington Post published a negative opinion piece. I mean, if you'd asked me a month prior, I would have said the degrowth was still largely unknown in the United States, ignored by our media. But clearly that is changing. First, what is it they say? First they ignore you, then they make fun of you, then they fight you, and then you win, right? Somebody in Europe said that they were in the making fun of us stage, and I was like, well, we're not there yet in the United States, but maybe we are. That would be a sign of progress. There's a lot to think about on the way home. And then that guy, Manuel Casal, he wrote an article actually about my visit, about my presentation on behalf of the Gaian Way, written in Spanish for a Spanish news site. And of course, I would be remiss if I failed to mention the International Degrowth Network. That was what basically has come out of the International Assembly, the International Degrowth Assembly that kicked off the conference. And this is really only just a little over a year old. The Gaian Way is a member, so you are invited to get active in it. Go to degrowth.net if you want to learn more. You can talk to me as well. I can hook you up. They've organized into various circles, and I've been trying to participate in the social media circle and also the transformative learning circle, although my capacity is really kind of at a limit. So, I welcome other people to get involved. And I mentioned degrowth.info is another great source, probably the premier website source of just general information about degrowth. And finally, of course, Earth Eclectic. I mentioned a couple times they did a special episode on degrowth and on this trip, this pilgrimage to Pontevedra. It's episode number 15. So if you go to eartheclectic.org, just look at the playlists. Under the playlist, you'll find episode 15, and you'll be able to hear the sound of a gaita. Thank you so much.